even those great souls like Master and Swamiji and Ananda Ma, Sri Yukteswar, all of the ones that we know about and all the ones we don't know about, St. Francis, Mother Teresa, they live in a state of great spiritual advancement and really experience this world very differently than we experience it. But they retain this extraordinary reverence for the lives and the events of these great souls. It never appears ordinary to them, and it never is something that they just take for granted and don't continue to find remarkable. Therese Neumann, whom Master writes about, of course, in Autobiography of a Yogi, and she was a very well-known Catholic mystic. She lived during the Second World War in Germany, actually. Hitler was said to be quite afraid of her. He wanted to arrest her or execute her, but he was also very afraid of her because he knew she had power greater than his. And she showed her extraordinariness in many ways, including the fact that she never ate or drank anything, but remained extremely strong and healthful. But for much of her life, every Friday afternoon, she would go through the events of this day, Jesus' arrest and his trial and his crucifixion. And she would bleed where he bled, and she would just transfer herself and relive that. Master said she was Mary Magdalene. And although most of Jesus' disciples did not stay with him at the cross, Mary Magdalene, John, Mary, and Mary's sister did. So she was there with him, and Master said that's why she would relive it over and over again. And when he went to see her in Autobiography of a Yogi, Master talks about how he went into a superconscious state so he could have her same experience. There's the intriguing thought that Master seemed to indicate, and Swami came to believe that Master himself had been Jesus. So there's a whole dimension of that reunion that one wonders about but never hears it mentioned. But you would think reliving that experience every week, and then gradually it happened not quite so often, would make her miserable, would make her sad, would make her tragic in her demeanor. But all the stories about her, and I've read several books, she was childlike, she was happy, she was lighthearted, she was extremely natural. In fact, the fact that she would travel with her friends and they would always be needing to get food, and they had all these physical needs that she never had, and she would make constant fun of them because of their complete reliance upon things, and she would recommend to them that her system was so much more efficient than theirs. And just in every way, when you read about her, well, she sounds like Swamiji, and she sounds like the stories that Swamiji tells about Master. She was just in a state of happiness all the time. And very difficult things happened going through the war. Many people who were close to her were taken away or killed or in various ways hurt seriously by the Nazi regime. But she retained this blissful confidence in the divine. And then every week she would still go through this experience. And one can only imagine what the inner reason for that was. I've never heard or read any explanation that explained to me why she chose that. Because on Easter morning, it was also Mary Magdalene who was the first to see Jesus risen. But she didn't, that wasn't what she relived. She relived his constant sacrifice. So reading hearing David read the Whispers that Master dedicated to this Easter Sunday, a greatest miracle of forgiveness was created by Jesus' words on the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And that's what Master pulls out of that crucifixion. He pulls out of it the extraordinary understanding that Jesus had of the human condition. And that prayer was that was no idle prayer, because the karma that was generated by the people who were there in the presence of Jesus, and yet instead of accepting the great love he had to give them, instead rejected it with so much force that they had to even take his life. They had to try to banish that power from the world altogether. And Jesus, instead of even being impatient with them, tried to intercede with God. Forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. They feel like they're doing a good thing, but we can see that all they're doing is creating more misery for themselves. But he's asking God to forgive the karma, on that understanding. I was remembering today, when I first came to Ananda, as often happens, our spiritual family, as Swami said to me, is very old. And he said, we have been all in all to one another, which we've been everything to one another, which means that all of our love relationships are also balanced by relationships of enemies and of antagonism and of disappointment and betrayal. And just all of those things have played themselves out as we've walked through this valley of confusion from delusion into bliss. And I had a particularly great enmity with one particular woman that was a huge trial of my first decade. And somewhere in that process, we both were able to verify past life experiences in which the enmity we felt in this life had a far different and much more dramatic and truly horrible expression on both sides. On the level of murder and destruction and just terrible. And my first impulse was to feel intensely justified, therefore, in the antagonism I felt for this person. And she felt equally justified, objectively so also, given our history, in her terrible attitude toward me. And we were both using the past to harden into to justify and rationalize our position. And Swamiji drew us together, and he said, first he verified that he thought our past life recollections were valid. So he didn't in any way say that we weren't that bad. He said, in fact, yes, you were fairly horrible. But then with so much sweetness, he said, but you've suffered and you've learned. And you would never be able to behave that way ever again. In other words, those people, that vibration of consciousness that you identified with has been burned out of you. And who you are now is no relationship to what you were then. Now I'm thinking of Jesus and Judas says, Jesus says to Pilate, Pilate is so aggravated because he's used to people being afraid of him. Pilate has this power of life or death, and none could stand before him indifferent. He's used to exercising that power, to inspiring fear and awe and obsequiousness in people. That's how power is exercised. And Jesus absolutely defies him. He defies him with silence in the face of his questions, and more powerfully, he defies him by being utterly indifferent to the power Pilate has, and therefore to the fact of life or death. Pilate pleads with him, don't you understand? I have the power to free you or the power to crucify you. And that motivates Jesus to speak. You have no power over me, he said, except that which God has given you. Now, Jesus is telling us not merely about this dramatic moment in his life, but he's telling us about all of us. Do we actually imagine that our friends, our relatives, our children, our government actually has power over us that was not given to them by God? In other words, that anything in this life can happen that is not part of this greater story, which is to bring us to God realization. And no matter how dark the valley or how horrible the past life experience or whatever it might be, or the agony of the present moment, do we ever imagine that we aren't at all times being guided by God through the absolutely essential pathway, which is the only way we're going to escape from whatever it is that binds us to that eternal freedom? And do we ever imagine for a moment that these great masters ever lose sight of us? Once that opening has happened and that desire for liberation is there, a prayer of love went up from earth and you responded. We say that every week in our Festival of Light. And that prayer was my prayer and your prayer. And you responded. And this story of the life of Jesus walking into this experience, I can only imagine that Mary Magdalene, Therese Neumann, just was so thrilled by the greatness of that love and by the power, as Master said, of forgiveness and compassion that motivated Jesus, that every week she wanted to be there again. And what we would think of as suffering and horror, she must have been able to see through it to that infinite, compassionate power of God that would give itself so completely for the salvation of others. And in the end, all he could say was, forgive them. They're trying. They're doing their best. Even Judas, the one who betrayed him, whom Jesus said was more to be pitied than Pilate, he was the one. Even he, Master said in the early part of the 1900s, he was liberated. That confusion and delusion which bound him and caused him to imagine that betraying his own master would somehow bring him something that he wanted, he suffered for it. And when he was suffering, whatever suffering God sent to him for those intervening years, whether in the astral world or this world, who knows, if we'd been present, we would have been so concerned about him and so anxious to have that suffering be alleviated. But Jesus knew, and the soul of Judas, whatever form it was taking, it knew that this was absolutely the path he had to walk for the freedom on the other side. Now, if we know, and if we never forget, that this is just the small price we pay for that bliss, why would we ever worry? Why would we ever even suffer? If it's a debt that has to be paid, bring it on, let us pay it. As Jesus said so simply, if they strike you on one cheek, turn to them the other. When they came to arrest Jesus, he didn't cower in the back. He stood, he stepped forward. There's so many parts of this story. They came to arrest him, and he stepped forward. When we see the abyss before us of the necessary suffering, for the suffering we've inflicted and the delusions that we've lived, lift our eyes to the hills. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord. And Jesus says, forgive them. Forgive them, Father. They know not what they do. We clutch to ourselves all of these little failings and we worship them. And we hold others so much to the narrowest, meanest definition we can think of. Whereas Jesus is the one who set the power in motion. That's what Master asks us to remember in his dedicated whispers to the life of Jesus. Father, forgive them. Two sides to that. One side is God's unconditional love. That's really something to meditate on, deeply and profoundly, forever. Unconditional love. People toss that word around, but think about it. Think really deeply on it. There's nothing we can do. Nothing we can do, no matter how evil, forgetful, gross, whatever, there is nothing we can do that can cause even the slightest diminution of God's love for us and the Master's love for us. Think what kind of people we would be if we really believed that. Think how free we would be, because what else would matter? Everything else in this world just comes and goes and comes and goes and comes and goes, and once this life is over, it's hardly a dream. But that love from God and gurus, everything else is just a cloudy substance. But that's real. That's what Mary Magdalene and Therese wanted to live over and over again. See how much God loves us. Remembering how much He loves us, let us live in joy. We're going to offer the purification ceremony now, which is an opportunity for each one of us to offer ourselves wholeheartedly, with absolute confidence, into the light of God, to be transformed by that power.